We are continuing our jaunt through Maccabees, and today we're going to look at the tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell would call it. The tipping point where now everything changes. And what happens is they're looking for a leader of the Jewish people to try to get everyone to obey the law. Now, let's stop for a second and kind of look at this whole situation again. What's going on? The king has declared something that has to be done. And the king's men have to enforce the law. They don't want to enforce the law. That's made very clear by previous passages that we looked at, but they have to because they are the king's men. And we've seen that whole reality that happens. A law comes down. People don't like the law, but they have to enforce the law because that's their job. And the only way for the law not to be enforced is if someone stands up and says, we're not going to enforce that law. And that's happened a few times here in our own country, and we've seen that in different situations. But that's what happens. Well, on the other side of the fence, what you have is the king's men, who we've already determined don't like the law, but it's their job to make sure everyone follows it, turns to a man by the name of Matthias, and let me make sure I pronounce that name right. No, I knew it. The minute I said it, I said, no, that's not his name. Mattathias. So he speaks to Mattathias, says, you are a leader and everything. So why don't you, they're in a new town, why don't you be the first to show everyone how important this is? And so that's what they did. So why don't you come forward, and you're now they were in the city of Modin. Why don't you come forward and you sacrifice as you're supposed to and do what you're supposed to do, and that'll get everyone. And then remember, what is the ultimate goal here? We'll build a peaceful society. And he says no. But that's not the tipping point. The tipping when he says no, and now all of a sudden you're going to end up with that same scenario. But while he's saying no, someone comes up and does the sacrifice, and he trips off the line, as we used to say in the Navy. He trips off the line and he kills them immediately. And hence the Maccabean revolt begins. So this is the revolt. Now, one of the things to look at is, how did we get here? How did we get to this revolt, which ultimately does lead to Hanukkah? But how did we get to this revolt? And the answer is, you have one group of people thinking in a very human factor without any connection to the divine, who think they're smarter than everyone else, and that's the king and his men. And then you have another group of people who are drawing on God's wisdom, and they refuse to follow what the king says because they are testifying to a greater wisdom. So how do you prevent the Maccabean revolt? By coming to an understanding, but it doesn't happen that way. And so then you end up with the Maccabean revolt. And it's a very important part. It's not very well known in a lot of circles. Remember, this is only in a Catholic Bible, and also within the context of Jewish scriptures, because from this comes Hanukkah. But Hanukkah, of course, we celebrate around Christmas. That we'll discuss. But as you can see, where did this whole thing come from? It came from a misunderstanding on both sides of the aisle, and no one comes in to connect. It's when you've got one side said, this is what we're going to do, and you're going to do it along with us, otherwise we will destroy you. And the other group says, no, we refuse, and go ahead and destroy us. You've already destroyed Eleazar, and you already destroyed the mother and her 7 sons. Go ahead and do it. And so there's an impasse. There is no way to cross that line unless there's someone can say, let's sit down, let's work with this. Unless someone who's going to go to the king and say, king, this isn't working. We understand what you're trying to do, but this isn't working. But no one does that. And so eventually You have the explosion, you have the war, and out it comes. And it's important to understand that, because when we look at these things that happen, every so often there is a law that comes down and people go, no, this is unacceptable. And you have these two groups that argue and fight, and no one says, let's find an understanding. And maybe the understanding isn't possible. We saw that in the Civil War. In the Civil War here in the United States, what was not possible? There was no way you were going to get the South to give up on slavery. And there was no way you were going to get the North to embrace slavery. Even though, and this went the extra step, even though you had this big fight back and forth, there was no understanding. There was no way you were going to get an understanding, and rightly so. But what made it worse, and what really made this whole thing worse, was a refusal for any kind of discussion, which in a sense you couldn't. How could you turn around and say, well, we can compromise on what we consider slavery? No. And then ultimately this grows in different ways. We can compromise on different things, and certain things you just can't compromise. So what happens is then you have ultimately war breaks out because you can't compromise, or no one, in this case, no one will compromise. What is their ultimate goal? To build a peaceful society. And they want to put together a religion that allows peace to reign, but it's a human peace. It's not a divine peace. What is the solution to this situation? Well, the fathers of the United States came up with the solution: freedom of religion. Just let it go. Don't let your battle be in religion. Let your battle be somewhere else, but don't let it be in religion. That's so intense. Freedom of religion. So if either side says you're not allowed here, the KKK hated Catholics. As a matter of fact, there was a reporter who came out and said right out of what the KKK would have said on Twitter, how we have to destroy the Catholic Church, or words to that effect. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, thank you for just citing exactly what the KKK said. And there is this intense divide between these two sides. And in this case, we're seeing in the Civil War, you saw this intense divide, and the divide could not be resolved without a war. In the case of slavery, in this situation, it could have been resolved. It could have been resolved with freedom of religion, but they didn't follow. They didn't see that. They just said, we have to obey the king. And the king says, this is what needs to be done. And I'm sure, as we've seen, the king himself tried to find a way to get through this in trying to get someone to eat the pork, and the person wouldn't. And even like Gabriel, if you eat the pork, I'll give you great riches. I'll have it. No, you don't get this. And the king couldn't rescind on his own law. And so what happens? Disaster ultimately happens because you reach the breaking point. And this is what we look at today. But this is why, when it's possible, and in many cases, it's not possible. There's a fascinating story that I actually wrote the article. So wrote an article about it. Fascinating story about the reality of those who are trying to force slavery on the entire country, and it's called the Fugitive Slave Laws. And I'm not into the pulling down of statues and all the other stuff. Well, with the exception of one. I don't know if you know the story, but Boris Johnson said when they wanted to pull down Winston Churchill's statue, Boris Johnson came out and said, well, who are you going to pull down next? Oliver Cromwell. And as an Irish American, I went, there's a statue of Oliver Cromwell? No, you pull down his first. But anyway, I'm just kind of, what's that? I just kind of on a little tangent there. When they wanted to talk about pulling down statues, and they said, our forefathers had slaves, and this was, well, one of the things that I discovered when I wrote this article is George Washington signed into effect the fugitive slave laws, which were these horrible laws that if a slave from the South or from wherever ran away, then he was a fugitive slave, and he would be, if he would be captured. They had bounty hunters and all. This is in our country. They had bounty hunters. He would be captured, and he would obviously, or she would obviously, run to the free states. Well, the law of the land, the federal law, was that they had to be captured and they had to be returned to their own states and their own original owners. And remember, they were treated as property, so they had no rights. And if a court hearing was to be held, which happened in Massachusetts, they required a court hearing. If a court hearing was to be held, then the fugitive slave wouldn't be allowed to testify on his own behalf because he or she was considered property. It was a horrible law, and it was strengthened not too long, I think it was the decade before the Civil War, and it was strengthened. This horrible, horrible law. And eventually, what's the tipping point? Civil War. But you always want to find a way to avoid the tipping point. In the case of the slavery, there was no way to avoid it, except if the South would give up slavery, which they weren't about to do. But there was no tipping point. There was no way to stop once you cross the tipping point without a war. There was in the case of the Maccabees. They could have turned around and say, to the king, and if he listened, say, this just isn't working. You've got to find out another solution. And like I said, the solution came thousands of years later with simple understanding of freedom of religion. So we look at that, and so this becomes the tipping point. So it's always important for legislators, for example, to always look at what are the effects of a law they make, and maybe they don't recognize what the effects will be until the law is put into place. And once the law is put in place, we didn't expect this to happen. Or after a study, they came up with some of the reactions that could happen, and we wanted to avoid those, so we changed the law, and so we changed the bill in such a way so that those wouldn't happen, but then something happens that we didn't expect. And so you can see that. You can see these reactions that happen, and here we're seeing this. You can assure the king that he probably said, well, this is really simple, and there's just maybe there'll be some resistance, but it won't be that bad, and we'll be able to quell it. All of a sudden to find out that the Jews said no, that many of the Jews, there were many Jews, as we see in today's reading, or went along with it, but there were many Jews that said no. And this is what happens when you put together a law and don't put at the bottom of it how to treat people as people of love and peace, love, joy, patience, kindness, generosity, and self-control. Those are the fruits of the Holy Spirit. How to put together a law that isn't based, on divine wisdom, human wisdom too, but divine wisdom, and isn't based on seeking to do that which is the best for all people. Not the best for some, the best for all. And this is what happens. And when you force people into something that they disagree with, then this is the disaster that can come out, because eventually you reach a tipping point and people say, just like the old song from Kiss. No, it wasn't Kiss. It was Twisted Sister. We're not going to take it. No. And this is when things go wrong, which, as we know, this is what happened during the Civil War in our own country. And this is when people say, this is what you'll do. Now, many people will go along with it for a little while unless something finally hits a tipping point. We saw that during COVID. And we saw what happened during COVID. And once the COVID thing came out, when it finally came to an end, people realized, no, we're not going to walk down that path. And now you just have to say the word COVID and people go, what? No, we're not going down that path again. Because, again, there wasn't a lot of communication. We used to say in the Navy that 99% of the problems in the Navy were caused by bad communication. This is so important to help people to understand. The forefathers of this country, the United States, understood it. We're going to talk more on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We'll be right back. Did you know that you can listen to Catholic Audio Media on the iHeartRadio app? Catholic Audio Media is now available through your iHeartRadio app. If you don't have the app, download it to your smartphone, tablet, or computer and subscribe through the podcast tab to Catholic Audio Media. You can also enable them through your smart speaker and hear them through the smart speaker as well. Just ask for Catholic Audio Media Podcast from iHeartRadio. You can hear them anywhere. You can listen to them as you're jogging. You can listen to them as you're preparing to go to bed. You can listen to them as you're eating and having breakfast or lunch or dinner. You can hear them anytime you want at iHeartRadio through the iHeartRadio app. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. So we're looking at this very human reaction to realities. And this is what goes on in dictatorships. This is what happens with the dictator. The dictator says, this is what you're going to do. We know the famous story of the death of Mussolini and his wife. Complete destruction. We know, and they were not only killed, but they were hung upside down in the town square. We know those stories because eventually, when you don't bring in the combination of love and everything else, when you just pontificate, as the word goes, although maybe that's a bad choice of words at this point, when you just pontificate, then what happens is that eventually there is a tipping point. Something goes wrong, especially if part of your tipping point is a very hard wall. If it's like it's my way or the highway, and this becomes a real issue. This is why this is not the way to govern. It's always you want to govern in combination, and that works in all ways. I'm not talking about any particular party at this point. And the reason is because both parties in our own government, and you find this right across the board, do this. They say, nope, this is what people will do because this will work. This is good. And we know certain bad laws pop up that we go, no, that's not going to work. Look at the famous story of what happened to the Japanese during World War II, because you couldn't trust the Japanese according to our own government. And the one who signed this into law was the great hero of we'll call him the Democratic Party, was FDR, who did some wonderful things, but he also signed into a law that forced the Japanese to live in internment camps. These things, you've got to think things through. And when you think things through, then this is what happens. And let's focus on the church in this case. This is what happens when you have people say, this is what the church teaches, and you have to follow this exactly, or you're going to hell. That's a dictatorship. No, and that's not what our church teaches. And our church teaches that, what I kind of get so intense over this. Our church teaches that in order to go to hell, you have to choose to go to hell. You don't turn around and break a law and then God is going to cast you into hell. What you do is you choose to go to hell. You see, we were talking yesterday about the blasphemy challenge. Well, there's a good example. Not that the blasphemy challenge, it's based on a complete misunderstanding of a phrase in the Bible, in the Gospels, but people who make a statement, what they were actually saying is, I reject God. Well, okay, But God will always reopen that door. I mean, you always have to know that there is no permanence to the blasphemy challenge at all. And unfortunately, I know there are many people that did it. I know there are people who are living today believing that they can never have a relationship with God ever because they did the blasphemy challenge. And that's a lie. It's a lie. It's not true. That door is always open. So we look at when these hard laws are given and no one looks at the bigger picture, what's going to happen. There's a guy on YouTube, and I can't remember his name right now. He's this great guy. He's based in California, and he talks about traffic. He does this great channel, and he talks about traffic. And I have to admit, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the channel. I've kind of looked it up. I can't find it. The guy's fascinating, and he's talking about travel. One of the things he brought out in one of his programs was that traffic engineers actually engineer a human factor into traffic lights. And there is a zone that they're quite aware of that as you're driving, and you're on a green light and all of a sudden it turns yellow. Well, they bring into the reality of your reaction time and your decision time and everything else when you're in that zone where the green light turns to a yellow light. Fascinating, because I never knew that. And it's like, well, so because what they're bringing in is the human factor. They're saying, well, you have to understand there's a human factor there. And when laws are created without a human factor, when moral laws are created without a human factor, and God always makes a human factor within the moral laws. And when people, this is one of the problems with these online influencers on YouTube. They take away the human factor, many of them, not all of them. And when you take away the human factor, then what you're doing is you're creating a dictatorship that's eventually going to lead to a rebellion. And this is one of the most fascinating things that you realize. So this is what we're seeing here, this human factor that comes in. And that human factor eventually, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, will hit a tipping point if there is no communication and if it is up against a wall where people are going to say, we've had enough. And this is what happens in Maccabees. When the time of negotiation is over, or maybe they never get into a negotiation, or they tried and it didn't work, and then all of a sudden, bam, we've had enough. And you know what? That happens with God too. That's the whole story of the prophets. What are the prophets doing? Prophets are communicating for God. The prophets are not there to say, this is God's law and I will destroy anyone who doesn't follow it. The prophets are there to say, the Lord has his law. If you don't follow it, disaster will happen. And if you keep rejecting God, eventually he's going to step in. That's God's way of communicating to people to find a solution, to find a resolution to the situation. And when they don't, then ultimately you have the tipping point of the rebellion. And that always has to be considered in every single, if you're doing this in a company. If you see this in companies, some boss sends down a rule. There's a famous story. There's a union that actually I got chased out to my car to when they kind of mocked me. Oh, really? And I'm not one of the people gets mocked. And so I was speaking to some people, and I said, the question is not whether or not to join a union. It's whether you should join this one. And I talked about a great battle that happened at a company where that union was. And there were problems on both sides. But the company decided to break the union. And what they ultimately did is they divided families. They shut down They successfully broke the union, but in doing so, wages were lost, and it was a horrible situation. And to this day, when I'm going through the supermarket and I see that brand name, unless that particular brand name is the only company that makes that product, and that I really have to want that product in order to do that, which is almost never, I won't buy the brand name. Because they ultimately reached a tipping point with their rule that caused an explosion, in a sense, a human explosion, meaning the people rebelled, it divided families, it broke the union, it hurt, it divided, it undermined wages, it caused great violence because there was no ultimate discussion. And when discussions came in, it was too late. This is what happens when we don't have that communication. Sometimes, as in the case of the Civil War, the communication couldn't happen. There was no compromise on slavery. That was it. And the actual issue with slavery ultimately came down to states' rights, and there was no compromise. There was no way. Well, ultimately, then that's what happens, and that's why we have a just war doctrine. But in other times, it's avoidable if we want to come to an understanding. We'll talk more on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Life can be challenging, but amidst the trials and tribulations, there is wisdom to be found. Welcome to Sirach 2, a chapter filled with timeless guidance and insights from the book of Sirach. In this chapter, we learn the importance of remaining steadfast in our faith, even in the face of adversity. It teaches us to be patient, for trials can shape our character and lead to spiritual growth. Seeking wisdom and understanding is of utmost importance. Sirach 2 reminds us to study the teachings of the wise, be open to correction, and follow God's commandments. By doing so, we can find true fulfillment and blessings. Don't be discouraged by the temporary prosperity of the wicked or the challenges you may face. Trust in God's justice, for he rewards those who diligently seek him. Join us on this journey of faith as we discover the path to a meaningful and fulfilling life. Sirach 2 is your roadmap to wisdom, patience, and eternal blessings. Read Sirach 2 and let its timeless wisdom guide you through life's ups and downs. Available now in the book of Sirach, part of the Old Testament. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. So, something to think about when you're, whatever rules you're coming up to, always put in the human factor. And when you do that, then that's going to make things go very well. But if you don't put in the human factor, then what's going to happen is you're going to create a disaster. And, many times, eventually you may bring in the disaster may happen that it just reaches a tipping point. Now, let's go back to the Civil War. What was the Civil War? Again, there was no compromise. Why? Because in slavery, whenever you see any kind of a genocide or any kind of destruction like you can see in slavery and everything else, it always begins by dehumanizing the persons who you want to destroy. And one of the problems with slavery is they dehumanized the slaves. They literally considered them no longer human or never were human. And that's where when you want to bring in the human factor, you have to begin there. So, we are dealing with human beings, and if they refuse to relent on that, eventually you're going to end down on the tipping point, which ultimately leads to civil war. And you want to avoid that as much as possible. But if people refuse, if they're like a brick wall, then eventually that's where it's going, unless somehow there can be a change made. And let's hope that never happens. Let's see you tomorrow. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.